Episode 175. Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast, and episode 175. I'm Scott Langdon, and this week it's time for another installment of the Life Wisdom Project. In today's episode, Jerry sits down once again with Dr. Jonathan Weidenbaum, and the two break down episode 16, God Takes Me Back to the Beginning of Everything. They unpack just a few of the many implications from episode 16 about how to live our lives, as well as what it might mean to have a God who is developing with us, as us, and alongside us. You'll remember Jonathan from episode 160, a Life Wisdom episode we called Spiritual Resilience, Navigating Loss and Finding Meaning. Check that episode out to hear more from Jerry and Jonathan if you haven't already. Here now are Jerry and Jonathan with this week's Life Wisdom Project. I hope you enjoy the episode.
And so, Jonathan Weidenbaum, thank you for doing this Life Wisdom discussion with me on episode 16, I think, which I don't know what it's officially called. I always think of it as creation because it's the emergence of the world and God simultaneously. And as I was, we exchanged thoughts a little beforehand, and my suggestion was we're going to relate this to our lives as individuals, as persons. Take seriously what I'm told here, the idea that God is a person. Yeah. And if you look at it from that point of view, God says re-experience that moment. He's asking us to kind of share God's experience of the beginning of the world, right, which is a lot like a neonate or something. In fact, it just made no sense at all to me. I'm in the midst of nothingness. Well, that might be a lot what it's like to be in the mother's womb, right? You're just in darkness and not much going on. And then, whoa, suddenly you're ejected and everything's sort of chaos, and your experience is just a chaos at that point, and you have little arms and legs, but you can't do much with them, and so on. And then it goes on from there. Does that make sense to you, Jonathan?
It puzzles me also, the idea of being in a nothingness. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of cosmological and philosophical sort of paradoxes there to unpack. I don't even know if paradox is the right word, but a lot to unpack. But certainly, there is a tremendous amount here that is relevant for life, for questions of how we should live our lives. And, it's interesting. One can maybe interpret your entire book as a series of revelations to you, as a body of religious experiences, a series of religious experiences, God revealing himself to you.
Yes.
And I know that in the beginning of the varieties, William James offers 3 criteria for assessing the veridicality or the truth-bearing nature of religious experience. Immediate luminosity, how much it grips, philosophical reasonableness, how it fits into everything else we believe about the universe, and moral fruitfulness. And if you don't mind, I'd like to concentrate on the last of those.
Okay.
Because the question that we're not exploring is whether it's true or not. I just want to talk about the moral meaning of all that's suggested in this really, really rich chapter.
Yeah.
And I got a little bit of a high from it, because if you remember, some of my own scholarship deals with William James's idea of a finite God, a God that is not an absolute in the sense that 100% mastery of everything. Rather, a God that herself has a history and develops over time and faces some kind of environment of its own, even if it's larger than ourselves. So of course, I don't forget that this God who reveals himself to you, if you don't mind me saying himself, is a person and yet more than a person.
Yes.
And yet this God has a history. The images of this God stretching its aching muscles, punching out its arms and legs, quote, I scramble to take control to provide order. It's interesting. Not only does the idea of a finite God resonate with me, with my interest in William James, and also some tendencies in the Jewish mystical tradition as well, but you turned me on to a book, Jerry.
Oh.
Yes, in your book, God and Autobiography, as told to a philosopher, I learned of John D. Levinson's book, Creation.
Amazing.
Yeah, and of course I read the book.
Its
And
title is Creation and the Persistence of Evil.
That's right. That's
by
right.
John, spelled Jon, Levinson.
That's right. And this idea, I just love, look, I'm no Bible scholar, but here's a Bible scholar from the Jewish tradition talking about sort of a God that has only kind of semi-tamed this cosmos and always trying to keep the great abyss in check. And of course, I think he suggests in either the preface or introduction to the book, he's not trying to suggest along the lines of process theologians of a God that's intrinsically finite, but yet still a cosmos that's only partly put into abeyance, so to speak, and that that nothingness is always, the waters are always sort of in partially threatening to flood or to submerge us, in this. So I'm struck by these images from your chapter.
According to Levinson,
Yeah.
I think he's saying this about goodness, but divine goodness, divine sovereignty,
Yes.
Is ultimate but not proximate. In other words, it's the big story.
Yes.
Either at the end or from the ultimate perspective.
That's right.
But meanwhile, where we are, you might say,
that's right.
It's a work in progress.
That's right.
So God is aborting, coming into being through this history, the struggle.
Hence, he
against chaos and against evil, I guess you might say.
That's right. I love this quote. But Lord, you are admitting serious limitations as you scramble to create order out of chaos. And of course, that's your quote from the text. And from your conversation with God. Of course, yes, in the Levinson book, this God is not intrinsically finite, rather, and how prayer in the Bible, according to Levinson, is performative. It's, in a sense, trying to not perform. Maybe that's not the right word. It's trying to invoke. It's trying to kind of get God to complete its dominion, so to her dominion, whereas these limitations are intrinsic, even if this God has, as he states, I already had unimaginable power and knowledge, limitations only from my perspective, he says, but still, this deity that is greater and more extensive than us, that's a person, yet more than a person, has an environment, has an outside to himself, that and has a history and grows all his own, and to me that has tremendous implications for questions of the meaning of the moral life. So when someone like William James, underpinning so much of his ideas is this idea of trying to inculcate the morally strenuous mood. But in order to do part of how he attempts to do that is rejecting this absolute idealist picture of a cosmos that's really just God by another name, and to invoke a God that himself is in struggle, and the idea that we are partners with this God, and this trying as sort of this idea of an unfinished cosmos is what kind of invigorates us to want to do. It kind of gives meaning to our effort.
William James, isn't it? And
yes,
what God says here.
Yeah.
Well, first, God is lonely. You can just be the cosmic one.
Yeah.
That's kind of lonely. And second, somehow God needs resistance. And the line is, did you pick up on that?
I did. In fact, I underlined that.
Yeah.
God says, before creation, I am pure spirit, sufficient unto myself. I felt I was lacking something: grounding, facticity, the blunt materiality, the hard edge to push oneself against, the resistance and friction that physical objects have. And, I was thinking about quotes to talk about. Well, that's one of the quotes, but yet I want to invoke a quote that I find meaningful by way of contrast to this,
Mhm.
and a contrast in which I hold this quote favorably. Because, in one of the I think in one of the Upanishads, understood through more of a kind of Advaita Vedanta kind of perspective, which sees this world of plurality as really ultimately Maya, that everything is nothing but Brahman in different forms, the ultimate expansive Satchitananda, bliss consciousness awareness, And there's a quote: all fear comes from the other, or anxiety comes from the other. That is, if you're caught up in the illusion of plurality and duality, then there's something outside of you that opposes you. Whereas if you realize that your true nature is one with the absolute, then duality and plurality are nothing but you see that they're illusions, and you're able to shove off that anxiety, the fear. Whereas I see the God of the God book, of the God in Autobiography, as kind of pushing in the opposite direction. This is it. God himself wants an outside, an other, without which real relationship is not possible, without which we cannot exert our energies, uh, as with God, so with us. So I appreciate it by way of contrast with a more cosmistic universe, which deems the universe as an illusion, whereas the God of the God book, of God in Autobiography, is one for whom, no, this multifaceted, pluralistic cosmos that God creates is of an inherent value. And real otherness is one of the conditions for genuine relationships.
Yeah, I think that's the conclusion here. You just stated it aptly, Jonathan, that for the world to be real, it has to offer resistance. There's no point in I don't they often in the Hindu tradition, on certain versions, they talk as if the world of appearances, objects are the world of appearances, and they're like divine play.
Yeah.
As if like a virtual reality that God, has a computer game or something. But what I'm told here is that no, God needs a real world.
Yes.
It's a real world. And moreover, a real world is unfinished and God is unfinished. How, what do you do with the child? You don't just bring it a bottle for the rest of its life. You put it, you have it learn things, you give it challenges. And that's what you do with the child, with the young adult, with each other. We give each other challenges. And that's how we grow and how the world itself comes into fulfillment, along with God coming into fulfillment.
And yet, there is also, yet in this story, there is also something of that wonderful play, that sort of that great show that is the cosmos, Yet I wanted more. In retrospect, the inanimate years feel very lonely. The emergence of life is a delight. With life, spirit comes into play. Wonderful to see amoeba, moss, and so forth. A little bit later, I love their myriad forms. I'm not alone anymore. There is this sense in which
It was my plaything.
Yes.
I did. It makes beautiful sounds, delightedly playing with it. The cosmos was my playpen.
Yes.
Beautiful, dazzling. So, but it's not play in the sense of unreal so much as it's real and wonderful.
Yeah. So it captures that spirit of this multicolor, multifarious, multi-sided universe, yet without rejecting its reality, without falling into a cosmism. It captures the play aspect of Lila Raza that we see in Vedanta, yet without the relativizing of the world, without deeming it as derivative to something more basic. And I like that. I like that balance. There's a lot of balance that comes. There's so much that is synthetic that you have, in the God book. So much that speaks to the mystical element, at the same time to the realist element.
Yes.
And I happen to appreciate that. I mean, this quote here is worthy of being very well known. I could not become a person without there being other persons. And then right here, the person is essentially interpersonal.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a whole you can unpack a book of wisdom on that quote alone, you
Yes.
know, and how, I mean, look, it doesn't even need to be spelled out. It's almost like I'm almost don't want to beat it to death, or because it's right there. It's just to be a self means to be related to what is not self.
Yes.
And really, truly, not only not self like that wall, but not self, another self. And that's what God needs. It's God is happy to have frogs and amoebas and bears and dogs. That's all lovely. They're less separate from him. The world is much less dualistic, more holistic, he says, instinctual, unself-conscious rapport that they have. I'm quoting from the book, but ultimately it's not enough. God needs to be set off from and against and related to other selves.
From full persons.
Yeah,
so the animals are wonderful.
Yeah.
Totally delights in the animals. They even have a kind of soul, I'm told somewhere in the book. But they lack, this is at least one key to the difference that comes out here. He says, but they have no second order reflection. They sort of just are. They move instincts from one moment to the next, and that's fine. If you're a dog, that's what you're supposed to do. That's your nature, and serves your purpose, and so on. But to relate fully, as you and I relate, well, we each have a second order consciousness. We're not only relating where we are aware that we are relating, and then that opens whole further dimensions. And yet we each have to be really real. Otherwise, it's not a relation.
That's right.
And the fact that we're embodied is a big plus. That's part of the story.
I must say, the chapter pleases me also, even aesthetically.
Oh.
The way it's sort of the movement of it,
Explain that.
Okay, sure. We go back to the very beginning. I mean, the language itself is beautiful too. We go back to the beginning, enter into me, and experience the beginning as I experienced it, So then there's the nothing. Then there's this God is almost like a primordial baby type thing. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but the opposite, pushing out its arms, stretching aching muscles, scrambling to control. And then, this God wanting otherness, wanting, something to press up against. I love that image. I think James has something similar to that, there's just something in our nature that wants something to press up against. So with God, then the creation of the animals and the beauty of that and the magic show of reality, and the how animals are kind of instinctually in tune with him, non-duality, and then this realization, but wait a minute, I need a higher level of awareness, and then it ends with, and so I created mankind, sort of pointing to the next chapter. I mean, I just kind of gave a basic replay of the chapter rather than explain why it's aesthetically pleasing. But there's a movement, there's a flow, there's a sort of, a kind of there's a dynamism that's pleasing here.
Yes.
And it takes us for a ride. It takes us for a kind of like puts us on a boat and takes us from one place to another, and the transfer of images and themes is something about it, and the way it ends, it's a kind of a cliffhanger. It's like, it's now we know next chapter is a very, very important one.
Yes, we need persons, and
It's
will we
pointing
get them?
outside of itself. Yeah.
Yeah. What will, and then what will happen once we do get persons?
Right. Right.
What you're seeing is a kind of aesthetic flow.
Yeah.
At a certain level, that must be the flow of the divine experience unfolding of with the world, because here God comes into being with the world.
Yes.
Rather than being a particularly pre-existing, though there's
Sure.
in the book, but also it may be you might say the natural flow of our own lives. They're constantly interrupted and disrupted and but then you might say the natural or ideal flow of our lives. And you see this if you hang around young kids before horrible things have happened or they've gotten too adult. There's just tremendous flow in their lives, a kind of playfulness and a learning and a wonderment. I have a little picture of my kids where one of them is looking over at what the other one is doing with this most intense interest in more or less nothing that's going on. But this intense interest is kind of the natural flow of life. And shame it gets distorted and interrupted and so forth.
You know what I'm also reminded of? In Peirce's category, this might be a stretch here. Charles Peirce speaks of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Firstness is just raw, pure immediacy, like basking in a nothingness in here. And then all of a sudden, needing other is the dyadic relationship, something to push up against, a reaction. And then, of course, the thirdness is kind of law or habit, which sort of, mediates between the two, or so there's a sort of, okay, it might be kind of like, pushing out the edge here. I might be grasping here, but there is something of that. There is something of this. There's almost, we're watching three stages here.
Yeah.
Pure immediacy, then reaction, then relation to what's not me, and then reflection,
Yes, reflection and norms. One of the things I was struck when just life is emerging. Well, he says, now we have life. And all these beings, animals, creatures begin to stir on the earth are amazing, God says. There's birth, growth, death, mating, offspring, colonies and flocks, emergent social orders, among the animals. Their social life is very amazingly complicated if you study it and rich. And ideality as well. Because once you're going somewhere in life, even at a kind of basic level, norms come in. There's better and worse. There's sickness and there's health. There's getting food and failing to get food. There's planting the seeds and failing to plant them, or whatever you're doing, rooting up the seeds. And telos and purpose, success and failure, standards of perfection and imperfection comes in at that stage, not yet as rich as with as with other persons, Homo sapiens sapiens, but already emerging in ideality, purpose, standards of perfection, imperfection, success and failure are kind of crucial to the picture here. What are you about? We're trying to God's trying to bring God's self into being. In the process, we are coming into being in cooperation, response to and cooperation with God's self. And there's a telos to it all. That's not discussed much here, but one kind of knows. Well, the personal is interpersonal. That's already a kind of a normative standard. You obviously let it down. Martin Buber talks about the I-thou relation or the I-it relation. So you can treat people as if they were just objects.
Right.
Well, that's not adequate, is it? And that's already implicit here in because you're treating them not as persons.
Yeah.
And then you're not a person if that's all you're doing.
Just like God comes into his own in relation to humans, so we come into our own in relation to others.
Yes, yes, yes.
And sometimes sometimes our finest moments are when we appreciate what is truly other in another human being and in our relation to them.
Yes.
And I find that to be a very profound theme. It's almost like God becomes an adult in relation to us,
Yes.
Grows into his own with his. That's a theme that many parents discover,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And I'm not a parent myself, but I'm an uncle, I guess. And I get him,
No, I've noticed it myself in relating to people who are parents and not parents. There's a dimension that people who've been parents tend to have.
Yes.
That it's hard to have just on your own without having been parents. It's a very special and peculiar, you might say, relationship to the child.
But that moment when a parent actually has to make a little distance just to be properly related to their child. There's an incredible scene, a moment in Buber's I and Thou. And Buber is critiquing the Buddha. And I'm going to place aside whether or not his scholarship about Buddhism is apt, so that someone else can do that. But he's quoting Buddhist scripture, and he's, sort of how the universe somehow is a figment of our own mind. And in I and Thou, he rejects that and says, no, there's a kind of separation from something we need in order to be properly related to it. And that strikes me like a really primordial, deep insight.
Yes. Yes.
Separation is a kind of condition for relating to something else properly. And of course, even in relating, using our entire being in relation to another as well, in the I-thou relation.
Yeah.
And I don't have that at hand. I can't whip it out in front of me, but that quote really strikes me as an important one.
Yes.
I appreciate how the affirmation of an unfinished cosmos, without which we could not exercise our moral energies, the embracing of this multi-faceted universe that we live in, with joy, and yet not seeing it as an illusion, and of course the necessity of becoming a self through our proper relations to others.
Yes.
There is no here that's instructive of how we should live our lives as human beings, just writ large in the life of the Godhead,
Yeah. One of the things I ask about later, because one of the things you just mentioned, Jonathan, is, and you've mentioned it several times, the sort of William James conception,
Yes.
The need for moral struggle, to kind of do something that's not easy, that you don't just float in air. And I ask at one point, well, does that mean this is just sort of like if you become a Marine and they send you to training camp, they send you on all these exercises and they're tough, these test you and you learn skills by doing them. Is it like that? Is it just exercises for our development, the way that is for the soldier training? No, I'm told there's real work to be done. The world actually needs fixing. Or not fixing as if it's a mechanical problem, but it needs development. It needs movement forward. And it's full of problems and full of problems that human beings need to address. And we are God's partners, which is that's not here so much. Maybe it's implicit already, but that's a rather noble vocation, you might say, to be God's partners, and that God needs us to do certain things.
It's very Jewish, among other traditions.
Yes.
Very Jewish. very William James.
Yeah.
So I guess you can call that post-Protestant, American philosophical tradition, very Whiteheadian, if you will, but it's also very, the Tikkun Olam, repair the cosmos, humans as a co-creator with the divine, very Jewish. And I appreciate that. I like how you said it's not like a gym coach about,
Yeah.
sort of to make this the to make us to build proper. I mean, although that may be part of it, but it's not the focus. It's a cosmos that needs fixing.
Yeah.
With human beings as not instruments, as partners. Yeah, and that's a profound idea. And you're right. It's implicit here. It's implicit here with a finite God evolving in an open-ended cosmos.
Yes, exactly.
It's funny because William James is a tremendous influence on Whitehead, and yet Whitehead pushes the Jamesian insights into more systematic, a far more systematic, pristine picture, but it loses a little bit of the Jamesian wildness to it. So I think a better comparison is with Jamesian thought. He captures something more of the wild, rugged-edged nature of the cosmos and a God in development with us. But certainly, it's definitely here.
You mentioned the Jewish tradition, which is, I think, an apt comparison, and James an apt comparison. But I also, speaking of the kind of Hindu traditions, I was guided to pray about Mahabharata, not those texts where one all merges or something, finds the world's an illusion and urge, and that's a war drama, like the Iliad, you might say, and our hero Yudhishthira, I could always just call him Yudi, likes to have these sublime thoughts and sit and talk to the holy men and so forth and speculate. And he's told, look, you're supposed to be king. You have work to do. And to be nobler and more holy or elevated or cosmic than anybody else is not your job. Your job is to get your work done. And so there's a reminder, and I take it, and I was pleased to find Eliade agrees with me. I read much later that this is a bit of a corrective to those other tendencies in Hindu thought.
I appreciate the analysis of the Mahabharata in the God book. And, outside of the Gita that we've all read, I've not read the other parts of it, but, I am very motivated to do so. My trip to the subcontinent will be this August. And one thing that I love about traveling that region is that you see bits and pieces of the Mahabharata along with the Ramayana and children's comic books in stores and out on TV, on the murals on walls, and it truly is such an important part of a whole civilization, but I too appreciate something of that. Ram is a warrior, he's that's the Ramayana. And the Mahabharata, the Pandavas are embroiled in battle, with people brothers, and I love that fact. I like how it's not often you see that thematized. It's not often, because everyone's so busy looking at the great Hindu theologians, the Vedantins and others, that not to return to the philosophical and spiritual importance of the more colorful narratives is a great thing,
Well, that's what I was told to go read. But I'd read those other things, looked at, excerpts from the Vedas, which are the most authoritative, and then the 13 principal Upanishads and so forth. I was always reading the foundational texts rather than the later theologians of the tradition. But then I was told, go read the Mahabharata. And when I was told that, I don't even think I knew Bhagavad Gita was one chapter in the extremely long Mahabharata. But
all of it, of course, you and I, we've spoken about the Peter Brooks version and our dissatisfaction with aspects of it, but our appreciation of what he was trying to do. Yeah, no. I
Well,
mean,
you need to learn from each religion what it has to offer and what its limitations might be. And one other thing I was going to mention that I think would be relevant for people's lives, as at least their lives as they try to think things through. When God is beginning says, I'm in the midst of nothingness, I say, my logical alarm went off.
mm,
And how can I make sense of this? I ask. And God says, don't worry
no,
now about making sense of it. Just
yeah,
listen. And I'm told something similar a little later that, oh, yeah, when I'm saying, oh, that doesn't make sense, I say it's completely unorthodox and embarrassingly anthropomorphic.
right.
What am I to make of that? God says, I'm not interested in what you make of it or in conforming my account to your prior beliefs. And then explains why God's using literal language. That's the only way to explain the experience of being God, and I object to that. And then that's where I'm told, well, that's, you might call what it's like to be God. That's what experience refers to. Well, I'm just puzzled. But I think something, at least in the spiritual life, but maybe other domains as well. We start out with a little fixed set of categories and a fixed set of beliefs, and we judge everything else by what we already believe. And it's wonderful to have spiritual intellectual openness where you're able to, well, I often think it's like encountering a strange culture or some brand new art form or style of music. I don't understand atonal music, but if you're going to ever understand it, you can't just object to it, you, and that would be true of any culture or new art form or new cultural form. You would have to pay attention to it sympathetically first
Yes.
and let it affect you.
Yeah, I like that too. I like that also. It's you have to soak it in, then you figure it out.
And then you
That comes,
figure it out
that comes,
later.
that comes later. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
experience the texture of it, the flow of it, and the feel of it, and then you can analyze. You know, but you can't start with the cerebral first,
right.
and I happen to like that.
Yeah,
I think that it's something of that vivid drama-like character, which really gives the God book its power. You know, the image of you looking at a fountain. You know,
yes, yeah.
right,
My initial image,
the
afraid.
analyses of things like the Mahabharata. You know,
Yes, yes, yes.
this colorful chapter, this God saying to you to grow up at one point. You know,
Yes,
all
yes.
you know. There is a lot that's kind of lyrical. It's almost like that section of the book of Job when God is getting dramatic with Job, and but these images he paints for Job,
Yes.
are truly, you know, I wish I knew the original Hebrew to read it in. You know,
Right,
the
right.
King James is majestic enough.
Yes, yes, yes.
No, there is a lot. There's a lot of drama here, and I like that. A lot
Yeah,
of
well,
color.
life has a lot of drama in
Yeah.
it. At least in the view I've come to, in part from, of course, these prayers, is that you're living a drama, and somebody reminded me recently, Charles Dickens' David Copperfield's rather autobiographical novel. He says at the beginning, I think the first sentence, I am the hero of my own story. And that's a good principle. You are living your story,
Um,
not necessarily heroically. I mean, that's what you would like to do, but you need to make yourself, you're the main character in your own story, even though that involves the interpersonal dimensions, the social dimensions, the historical and global dimensions. But still, you're living this life and living it with the divine. And it is a kind of drama
but
with
also
ups,
how,
downs.
sorry, interrupted you. I
Go ahead.
apologize. But how very apt, particularly for the God of the God book, who is a person, who tells you get more anthropomorphic, who develops, you know, perhaps something a bit more dry and abstract would do well with a pantheistic type system. or in a cosmistic type system, or a Platonist or a Neoplatonic or an Advaita Vedantin picture of the cosmos, but not your God who's a person and yet more than a person, but also a person. You know, how apt.
Yeah, I was thinking later about
Yeah.
this anthropomorphic concept, which is so unfamiliar and alien to our 21st century thinking.
Yeah.
But there is that saying, man is made in the image of God.
Yeah.
Well, I think that would rather suggest that we are somewhat theomorphic,
Yeah.
and God is somewhat anthropomorphic.
Right.
We are not alien entities,
yeah,
facing one another.
Sure.
But we share in some way, some element of nature.
Yeah.
Obviously, God in Autobiography never suggests God is more anthropomorphic than what we see here.
Right.
It's not walking around. You can't make little statues of what God looks like. Not like the Greek gods, where you can have a pantheon and there they all are. But still, there's some shared affinity in basic nature between the human and the divine.
Yeah. That's a profound notion.
Yes.
It's a very interesting notion. I think, believe it or not, there are certain kinds of Mormon theology that approach this.
Is that right? Well,
Yes,
interesting.
Which is fascinating to study in their own right. But this is a striking notion, and it definitely departs a little bit from the sort of Aristotelian and Platonic flavor of so much traditional theology that we've imbibed for so many centuries, you know. And it's a striking notion.
Well, interesting. Well, thank you, Jonathan. We've probably overrun our time, but that's fine with me. And wish you well, and we'll stay in touch.